Welcome to another video in this series on advanced orchestration techniques. In this video, we are going to start discussing how to arrange chord progressions and other harmonic material for the orchestra. Arranging chords for an orchestra is a little bit different than writing a chord progression for either the piano or guitar. It requires special attention to be given to both which instruments you choose to play and the structure of the chords themselves. In this video, we are going to focus on chord structuring. We'll start by studying the harmonic overtone series, and then learn how it reveals the best strategies for making sure your chord progressions sound clear and effective in your next arrangement. So with that, let's get started. So anytime that you're arranging chords or other harmonic material for the orchestra, you need to pay careful attention to your structure. In other words, you need to pay attention to the chord tone spacing and the chord tone weighting. Chord tone spacing is just essentially how far each note of your chord is placed vertically compared to the others. Chord tone weighting is essentially how many times each chord tone or scale degree appears vertically when spelling out a chord. Both of these concepts are incredibly important in orchestration because messing up even one of them can result in a muddy and unprofessional sound in your music. And the reason why has to do with something called the harmonic overtone series. The basic idea behind the overtone series is that every single note you hear actually consists of multiple pitches working together, called partials. For example, let's say that you pluck the cello's lowest string to play a C2 or low C. This is the pitch that we consciously hear, and it's called the first partial, also known as the fundamental. However, the sound itself also contains several other partials. If you were to divide the string in half by pressing it down in the middle and plucking it again, you would find the second partial, which sounds an octave higher than the fundamental. So in this situation, we would hear a C3. If you were to divide the original string into a third of the original length, you would hear the third partial, which would be an octave and a perfect fifth higher than the fundamental. In this situation, a G3. If you wanted to continue to find more partials, you would simply keep dividing the string by the partial number. So the fourth partial would be played on a string 1/4 of the length of the fundamental. The fifth would be played on a string 1/5 the length of the fundamental, etc., etc. And this pattern continues into registers so high that human beings can't even hear all of the partials being played. For our purposes, however, we only really need to concern ourselves with the first 8. What all of this means is that whether you are conscious of it or not, every time you hear a note played by an instrument in the orchestra, you are also hearing each of its partials as well. And no matter what pitch you start with as your fundamental, each of its partials will always follow the same pattern. At first glance, these pitches might all seem to be a little arbitrary. But if we look at them through the lens of a major chord, we start to notice a pattern. This pattern of root, root, fifth, root, major third, fifth, flat 7, and root is at the core of what makes the overtone series so important for orchestration. It's the reason why it forms the backbone for both our understanding of chord spacings and chord tone weighting. For example, if we look at the overtone series, we'll notice a pattern that actually serves as the default strategy for voicing chords, using open voicings in the low registers and closed voicings in the upper registers. If we look at our example of the overtone series for low C, we see that the first 4 partials are C2, C3, G3, and C4. If we treat this like a C major chord, we'll notice that we've actually skipped several notes in between. Specifically, we've skipped E2, G2, and E3. That's 2/3 and a fifth. However, if we start with the 4th partial and look at the remaining pitches, we find a fully written closed voicing C7. In other words, we have a C dominant 7 chord that doesn't skip any notes. It goes C4, E4, G4, B flat 4, and then C5. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this is exactly what your default chord orchestrations should also look like. You should use open voicings in your lower registers and closed voicings in your upper registers, which, for practical reasons, could be considered anything higher than a G3, or the G just below middle C. Now, this first idea is a pretty strict rule, as close to a law of orchestration as we are going to get. If you do not use open voicings in your lower registers, then the different partials of each note are going to clash together, and your sound is going to be all muddy and dissonant. This can be somewhat avoided by having your instruments play quietly in the low register. But in general, you should stick to octaves and perfect fifths in your lower voices if you want to keep your voicings nice and clear. Now, the second idea, which is having closed voicings above G3, isn't nearly as strict. This one is more like a helpful suggestion. Some instruments, like the strings, can do open voices with no problem, while others, like the brass, tend to leak a bit of power and become unstable when not written in closed voicings. This is usually due to differences in power and tone color across the instrument's different registers. But either way, the impact of ignoring this suggestion will not be nearly as devastating as it would be to ignore the first one. However, this isn't the only useful information we can find. We can also learn about the chord tone weighting. As a reminder, chord tone weighting has to do with how frequently each of the particular chordal tones appear vertically in your arrangement. In other words, a simple C major triad has 3 notes. But if you want to arrange it to be performed by a full string section, you have 5 voices to work with. So which notes should you double in octaves and which ones should you avoid doubling? Well, our default model is something called the 1-5-3-7 rule. The 1-5-3-7 rule is the second guiding principle we can take from the overtone series. Simply put, it provides us with an order of priority for reinforcing or doubling different notes of a chord. It ranks the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th in terms of importance based on how frequently they appear in the overtone series. The 1st, or root, always takes the highest priority because it literally makes up half of the notes in the first 8 partials. And the 5th takes the 2nd priority, since it appears 2 times. Then we have the 3rd and the 7th, which are the least important notes, since they each appear only once in our first 8 partials. The reasoning behind this is that the more times a note appears in the overtone series, the more times you can double it with the other voices before its own partials begin to clash with those of the other notes in your chord. If you have too many 3rd notes, for example, then their partials are likely to clash with the other notes and create a muddier sound in your music. It's a much safer option to just simply double your 1st or your 5th instead. So when applying this practically, anytime you voice a chord, you can use the full triad. Sticking with our example of C major, we can spell out the full chord by making sure each note appears once. Then, if we are looking to use more than 3 voices, we can feel free to use either the root or the 5th scale degree, because they're both safe options. However, if we're looking to keep a clear sound, we'll want to avoid using either the 3rd or 7th scale degrees, because we don't want them to appear more times than either the root or the 5th in a single vertical spelling. But what happens if we want to work with chords other than triads and 7ths? Well, in this case, we can adjust our initial strategy and use something that we will call the strong root and equal upper voices strategy. In other words, whichever note is the root of your chord should appear the most times in your chord spelling. And all of the other notes should be represented by an equal number of voices. So long as you keep this information in mind, you should have no problem creating a clear and effective arrangement for your chords and other harmonic material. And with that, we have reached the end of another video. I hope you found it helpful. I want to take a quick moment to thank my wonderful patrons who make videos like this one possible. I also want to thank each and every one of you who show your support through the many kind emails, comments, and messages that I receive. It means more to me than you know. If you would like to show your support, there are links in the description below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music.